Adaptation to Climate Change in Developing Countries. Lesson 4. Domestic Policies of Adaptation to Climate Change. The policies to adapt to climate change is to reduce vulnerabilities to negative effects of climate change, while at the same time exploiting positive effects and opportunities. This is in order to adjust social and economic systems, for the government to take measures such as legislation, regulation, and compensation. In response to effects of climate change, Korea and other countries have established national plans and are taking various measures. The Paris Climate Change Accord, which took effect in November 2016, prescribes that national adaptation plans shall be established and implemented, which explains that in order to prepare comprehensive and long-term adaptation policies, it is very important to arrange and implement adaptation plans at the national level. From this course, you can explain Korea's policies of adaptation to climate change. So, should we begin the course? 1. Korea's policies of adaptation to climate change. The Framework Act on Low-Carbon Green Growth, which took effect in April 2010, consists of 7 chapters and 63 articles. It plays a role as a framework law to prescribe matters pertaining to climate change. Among others, in some articles of the law and its enforcement ordinance, there are issues such as effects of and vulnerabilities to climate change and establishment and implementation of the adaptation measures which are directly related to adaptation to climate change. The Green Growth Act prescribes establishment and implementation of various framework plans, such as National Strategies on Green Growth, 5-Year Plan on Green Growth, Basic Plans to Respond to Climate Change, Basic Plans for Sustainable Development, Basic Energy Plans, and various other basic plans. It also prescribes to establish and enforce the plans related to climate change, such as the Basic Plans to Cope with Climate Change and National Adaptation Measures. The plans directly related to climate change are divided into the Basic Climate Change Plans established every 5 years over a period of 20 years by the Office for Government Policy Coordination, and National Climate Change Measures prepared every 5 years by the Ministry of Environment along with related ministries. Korea, in accordance with the Framework Act on Low-Carbon, Green Growth, and its enforcement ordinances, establishes national measures to adapt to climate change every 5 years and obliges central administrative agencies, metropolitan cities, provinces, cities, countries, and districts to establish detailed enforcement plans pertaining to the matters pertaining to the national adaptation measures. In April 2010, when the Act took effect, only metropolitan local governments were obliged to prepare and enforce the plans. However, after the revision in December 2012, basic local governments were required to establish and implement the plan. Korea, starting from the first general measures to climate change to its 4th measures, established the plan 4 times. As for adaptation, the 3rd general measures invited related discussions by suggesting projects related to construction of the base for adaptation to climate change. Korea's first plan for measures to climate change was established by 13 ministries in 2008, named National General Plans to Adapt to Climate Change. The general plan was a basic one, presenting the national vision and direction for adaptation. It was established as a major action plan for the nation's long-term vision, low-carbon, green growth, and pan-governmental participatory general plan. Also, it presented its vision, construction of a safety society, and support for green growth through adaptation to climate change. As the Framework Act on Low-Carbon Green Growth took effect in April 2010, in October the same year, Korea's first legal plan to adapt to climate change, titled the First National Climate Change Adaptation Measures, were established jointly by 13 ministries. The first adaptation measure included 7 areas: health, disaster hazard, agriculture, forestry, marine affairs fisheries, water management and ecosystem, and 3 basic measures: monitoring prediction, adaptation industry energy, and education, promotion and international cooperation, covering 10 areas and 87 projects. After 2 years from the establishment of the first measures, a new climate change scenario was introduced. Based on this, results of climate change impact analyses were renewed. After the establishment of the first measures, the changed conditions and issues of climate change were reflected, which revised and supplemented the first measures in December 2012. The modified and supplemented measures included health, agriculture, and fisheries, water management, disaster hazard, forestry ecosystem, land coast, industry, infrastructure, international cooperation, and climate change, monitoring and prediction, covering 9 areas and 67 projects. In December 2015, the first national climate change adaptation measures were completed, and Korea considered to succeed and share the performance of the first measures, and delved into changes of climate environment, socioeconomic changes, and demand for domestic and overseas sources, which resulted in the second national adaptation measures. The second national adaptation measures were supervised by the Ministry of Environment, which was supported by 20 related central governmental agencies, covering 7 areas of health, water, forestry ecosystem, land coast, industry energy, agriculture, and livestock and marine affairs and fisheries. Among others, 87 climate change risks were prioritized as they needed to be tended first. The second national adaptation measures had the vision to construct a safety society where its people are happy based on adaptation to climate change. Its goals included reduction of risk coming from climate change and realization of opportunities. It consisted of 4 policy areas, 5 policy directions for implementation, and 20 focused projects. The second national adaptation measures presented the 5 principles of adaptation, such as conformity to sustainable development, consideration of vulnerable classes, bases on sciences, holistic approach, and facilitation of participation, so that it could be linked with sustainable development, in order to derive substantial performance of the second adaptation measures. Performance indices and core indices by policy were established, followed by monitoring of implementation and assessment system arrangement. Accordingly, a base has been established to strengthen the arranged adaptation policy and effectively and efficiently run policy feedback processes from policymaking, implementation monitoring, assessment, and modification. In addition to the national-level effort, Korea's 17 metropolitan cities and provinces and 226 cities, countries and districts have established and are implementing detailed plans for adaptation based on the enforcement ordinance of the Framework Act on Low-Carbon Green Growth. Adaptation plans established at the level of local governments are detailed plans pertaining to adaptation policies at the level of metropolitan cities, provinces, cities, countries, and districts, working based on Article 38 of the Enforcement Ordinance of the Framework Act on Low-Carbon Green Growth. They will be established every 5 years, and areas of measures can be added or deleted in consideration of conditions and characteristics of local governments, in addition to the areas designated by the central government. Detailed implementation plans at the level of local governments are comprehensive plans covering directions, strategies, and action plans for every area to cope with changes coming from climate change. The basic law for Korea to promote its adaptation to climate change is the above-mentioned Framework Act on Low-Carbon Green Growth. Additionally, central government agencies such as the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport, the Ministry of Health and Welfare, the Ministry of Food, Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, the Korea Forest Service, and the Ministry of Environment have prescribed matters pertaining to adaptation to climate change in their laws under their jurisdiction and are enforcing relevant policies. Korea's Ministry of Environment recommends 49 public institutions and local public corporations that own and manage public facilities, which may be greatly affected by the effects of climate change, to establish adaptation measures, provides guidelines covering methods and processes of planning, hosts education and workshops related to methodologies, and is supporting all the matters related to preparation of adaptation measures. Accordingly, among those institutions that manage power facilities, oil and other resources management facilities, transportation and city infrastructure facilities, environmental facilities, water supply facilities, and waterworks facilities, 13 institutions are carrying out their own adaptation measures, while 26 institutions are preparing for their own adaptation measures. Then what processes are taken to implement the policies related to adaptation to climate change? Most of the policies prescribe their objectives at the stage of policy making. Identify the status of achievement of the goals during the implementation term, and derive effects from the implementation, which is a base to decide whether a certain policy has been successfully enforced. On the other hand, adaptation policies will be arranged based on prediction and prospect of the future that we have not experienced yet. Therefore, it is difficult to present clear goals. It is also not easy to assess policy effects over a short period of time. Therefore, while the same applies to all policies, as for adaptation, feedback is very important as it requires us to continuously and consistently monitor implementation of the policies, inspect the process of implementation, and revise and supplement the policies based on the conditions. Accordingly, the countries that are already implementing their policies through adaptation plans are recently trying to develop and apply the systems and methods as to how to monitor adaptation policies and evaluate whether a policy has been successful or not, as well as the effects. Summary. Let's review and summarize what we've learned so far. We learned about domestic policies of adaptation to climate change. We will learn about vulnerability to climate change in Cambodia next time. Goodbye.